One of the things that you'll notice about the Spring Framework is that it strives to provide developers with choices. Often, there are multiple methods to achieve the same end in Spring, and this allows developers to pick their favorite approach. Spring Boot adheres to this principle and it allows developers to choose between different approaches of configuring their Spring Boot projects. So aside from our application.properties file, we are also provided with an approach using YAML. YAML is a serialization format that follows a hierarchical structure. It's very similar to JSON in the fact that it uses key value pairs. YAML is really popular amongst the Ruby crowd, so if you know Ruby, you may already be familiar with this format, but for most Java developers, this is something new. Don't be alarmed, Spring provides us with a lot of great ways to work with YAML, and it will really assist you as you work with the new format. So let's dive right in and we will create our application.yaml file. And this will provide our configuration in the YAML format for our Spring Boot project, ultimately dictating its behavior. So right alongside our application.properties file, we're going to open the new dialog by pressing Control N, and then we will add a new file. We'll hit next, and then we'll specify the name of this file as application.yml, and that's the YAML file extension. So with this file in place, I'm actually going to go ahead and rename our application.properties file. So just select the file within the Package Explorer and hit F2, and it'll open up this Rename Resource dialog. And then just put a 2 in the name. That way Spring Boot ignores our application.properties file. Now we will return to our YAML file and we're going to duplicate the configuration that we put within our properties file. You'll notice that STS has given the application.yml file a special icon, and that's indicating that STS realizes this application.yml file is special to our Spring Boot project. So for those of you who are concerned because you may not know YAML, if you hit Control Space, you should be a little bit relieved because you'll notice there's some great IntelliSense built into STS for those of us who are not intimately familiar with YAML, but it's not very complicated. So if I start to type server, which is one of the properties or one of the configurations we'll need to specify, you'll see that I can choose the server.port property, and if I go ahead and select that, the IntelliSense will actually put that property into the appropriate format for YAML. And as I mentioned, YAML is hierarchical based, and you can see that all it did was indent the port property, which is nested under the server node there. And that's how we define our different properties in the hierarchical format is by nesting in further from the parent node. So here we see this child node is nested further within from the parent node, and that makes it kind of an extension of the parent. So we're going to specify that our port is going to be 9001, and then we're going to head to the next line and we'll define our next property, which is the context path. Now notice how this additional property is just nested within the parent. So we're specifying multiple properties here via kind of a key value pair syntax that we would use in JSON, and we have that parent node of server, the two child nodes of port and context path. So let's go ahead and we'll specify our context path as /test. And then we're going to actually put in our own property here. So we'll specify a type node and we'll say that the type is going to be framework. And then we will specify the name node and we're going to say Spring Boot just like last time. And you'll also see that we can use the placeholders within YAML. So there's some familiarities there between application.properties and application.yaml. And just further looking at IntelliSense, you'll see it's going to do a lot of nesting for you. So here, if we pick this property that looks like it has about 4 levels of nesting, it will complete that for you as you work through defining the configuration for your project. The other neat thing is if you are working within one property, so let's say here we're working with the active MQ node and we specify a broker URL of something, and then we come up here and we are working within the active MQ node and we're going to specify a password. Notice it automatically groups that where it should be nested within that appropriate node. So STS has some great IntelliSense built into it where it's really not that important that you have this in-depth understanding of YAML. So I'll go ahead and remove that node and I'll save our application.yaml file. Now we'll go ahead and relaunch our application so that we can confirm that our YAML configuration is in fact working. So if we go to, let's say, localhost 8080, this should fail. But if we go back to our 9001 port, I believe it was this time, you'll see that if we hit the test directory, we get our response back, and it uses the placeholder that we had included within our YAML configuration. So there we've seen another way that we can override the auto configuration of our project using the YAML format. So it's just a little bit different. It's an alternative to application.properties. This would be probably more appropriate for the folks coming from a Ruby background, or if you're just interested in a more hierarchical format for your configuration. Before we conclude our lesson, I just want to show you one last tidbit that's really interesting. If we go to our pom.xml file and we take a look at our dependency hierarchy, you'll notice that looking at our dependencies that we have the snake YAML dependency, and this is actually the YAML parser. Now, it's really not provided by the web dependency, it's actually within the starter project. But that parser was included to parse your YAML, and you didn't even know it. And it's because we used a starter POM or a starter dependency with Spring Boot. So that just illustrates the power of Spring Boot. There we're working with this different type of format to basically represent data, and we didn't even have to think about pulling in the parser for it. It was just pulled in for us because we told Spring Boot that we are building a web application, and it knows that, well, when you build a web application, maybe you'll be using YAML. So it really demonstrates the power of Spring Boot as we work through this lesson and didn't even know we needed that dependency on that artifact.